noticing the shift around her. She stirred her tea with a slow, practiced motion, completely unaware that the peace of the diner was about to be shattered. Roy, the leader of the bikers, leaned back in his seat, his eyes lazily scanning the room until they landed on Miss Ruth. A smirk curled at the corner of his mouth. There was something about her, the way she sat there, completely unbothered, as if she existed in a different world. It annoyed him. Maybe it was the quiet dignity she carried, or maybe he was just looking for trouble. He stood up, stretching his arms as he made his way toward her table. The other bikers watched, grinning, waiting to see what he would do. He stopped just beside her booth, towering over the elderly woman, his presence casting a shadow over her table. "Hey, Grandma," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You seem a little too comfortable in here. How about you share some of that tea with me?" Miss Ruth looked up, meeting his gaze with the same calm poise she carried everywhere. "Young man, I don't believe I invited you to my table," she said, her voice firm but polite. Roy chuckled, shaking his head. "Feisty one, huh?" Then, without warning, he reached out and knocked her tea over, the hot liquid spilling across the table and onto her lap. Gasps rippled through the diner. The waitress froze, the family with the kids stiffened in shock, and even the teenagers put down their phones. But before anyone else could react, before Roy himself could fully process what he had just done, a voice cut through the air. A voice that carried a quiet authority, a weight that could not be ignored. That, the voice said, low and steady, was a big mistake. Roy turned, his smirk faltering as he locked eyes with the man who had spoken. Mike Tyson had stood up. The former heavyweight champion pushed back his chair with an eerie calm, the muscles in his jaw flexing as he took a slow step forward. His hoodie was still up, but there was no mistaking him now. The moment his name registered in Roy's mind, the color drained from his face. Mike didn't say another word. He didn't have to. His presence alone carried a threat stronger than anything Roy or his crew had ever dealt with. For a long, tense moment, the diner held its breath. Then, with a nervous chuckle, Roy raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, man, no need for trouble," he muttered, taking a step back. "Just messing around." But Mike didn't blink. His stare bore into Roy with an intensity that could break a man without ever throwing a punch. "Apologize," he said, his voice still calm, but now edged with something dangerous. Roy swallowed hard. He turned back to Miss Ruth, his bravado completely drained. Sorry, ma'am," he mumbled. Miss Ruth, ever composed, dabbed at the spilled tea with a napkin and nodded. "I accept your apology," she said simply. Satisfied, Mike sat back down, his focus returning to his meal as if nothing had happened. The message was clear, this was over, and there was no need to take it further. The bikers wasted no time. They shuffled out of the diner as quickly as they could without outright running, their confidence shattered. The room slowly came back to life. Conversations resumed, though now hushed, filled with whispers of what had just transpired. Miss Ruth, unfazed, called the waitress over. "Another cup of tea, please, dear," she said with a warm smile. "And Mike?" He simply took another bite of his burger, nodding slightly in her direction. Just another quiet afternoon at Mildred's diner. Years of fighting and survival told him trouble was brewing. He could sense the shift in energy, the way Roy carried himself, like a man who thrived on making others feel small. Roy's gaze locked onto Miss Ruth again, and this time, he didn't just smirk, he stood up. With slow, deliberate steps, he made his way to her booth, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. The other bikers watched, grinning, their amusement barely masking the underlying tension in the air. Well, Roy drawled, leaning against her table. "Ain't every day you see a queen sittin' all prim and proper in a place like this." His voice dripped with mockery, but Miss Ruth didn't flinch. She placed her teacup down gently, finally meeting his gaze. "And it's not every day a grown man feels the need to bother an old woman just to feel important," she replied, her voice as steady as ever. A few quiet chuckles from nearby tables broke the silence. Roy's grin faltered for just a second, but then he let out a laugh, though it lacked humor. "You got a smart mouth, lady," he muttered. Then, without warning, he reached out and flicked the edge of her cup, spilling tea onto the table. The diner went silent. Miss Ruth exhaled slowly, dabbing at the spill with a napkin. She didn't look scared. If anything, she looked disappointed. "Now, that was unnecessary," she said simply. Roy was about to say something else when another voice, low and measured, cut through the room. "That's enough." Roy turned, his smirk returning, until he saw who had spoken. Mike Tyson had stood up. He moved with an unsettling calm, pushing his chair back as he rose to his full height. His hoodie was still up, his expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking him now. The atmosphere in the diner shifted again, but this time in a different direction. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew what he was capable of. Roy took a half step back, his bravado cracking. "Hey, man, I was just..." Mike tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving Roy's. "Apologize," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that left no room for argument. Roy hesitated, looking around as if hoping someone would step in and save him. No one did. Even his own crew stayed silent, their earlier amusement now replaced with unease. Mike took a step closer, and that was all it took. Roy swallowed hard and turned back to Miss Ruth. Sorry, ma'am," he muttered, barely meeting her eyes. Miss Ruth nodded, as composed as ever. "Apology accepted," she said, before picking up her napkin and calmly continuing to clean up the spill. Mike didn't say another word. He simply sat back down, picking up his burger as if nothing had happened. Roy, no longer interested in making a scene, turned on his heel and walked briskly back to his booth. A moment later, he and his crew were gone, slipping out the door without another word. The diner remained quiet for a few beats longer before life slowly returned to normal. Miss Ruth glanced over at Mike and gave him a small nod of gratitude. He returned it, then went back to his meal. Just another afternoon at Mildred's diner. Didn't even blink. He simply stood there, his expression unreadable, his presence heavy like a storm waiting to break. The silence stretched, pressing against the walls of the diner. Every patron held their breath, watching the standoff unfold. Roy's bravado flickered, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest, trying to reclaim the dominance he was rapidly losing. Mike finally spoke, his voice low, steady, and carrying the kind of authority that needed no volume. "I said, leave her alone." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a challenge. It was a statement, an absolute truth that left no room for negotiation. Roy hesitated again, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. The air between him and Mike was charged, electric, as if one wrong move would set off something irreversible. Then, Roy scoffed. A forced, hollow laugh. He turned away slightly, shaking his head like he found the whole thing ridiculous. But everyone could see it, he was backing down. "Whatever, man," he muttered, spitting the words out like they left a bad taste in his mouth. "I don't got time for this." He cast one last glare at Miss Ruth, who, through it all, had remained poised, untouched by his attempts to shake her. Then, without another word, he turned and strode back to his booth. His crew hesitated for a beat before following, their earlier amusement completely gone. The moment Roy sat down, the energy in the diner shifted again, but it wasn't back to normal. It was something else, an unspoken understanding that something had changed. Miss Ruth picked up her napkin, dabbing at the last few drops of spilled tea before glancing toward Mike. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice warm, but firm. Mike nodded once, wordlessly, before settling back into his seat. He picked up his burger as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just shut down a man twice his size without lifting a finger. The waitress finally exhaled, her hands unclenching from the tray she had been gripping. Conversation slowly returned to the diner, though everyone stole glances at the corner booth where Mike sat. Roy and his crew? They finished their meal in silence. And when they left, they didn't make a show of it. No loud voices, no cocky grins. Just the quiet shuffle of boots against tile as they slipped out the door. Miss Ruth took another sip of her tea, unbothered, as if it had all been nothing more than a passing storm. And Mike? He just kept eating. Trembled slightly as she accepted her purse. "I am now," she said with a quiet smile, her dignity still intact despite everything that had just happened. The tension in the diner slowly began to ease. Conversations picked up again, hushed at first, but gradually returning to normal as the reality of what had just unfolded settled in. The waitress, still shaken, took a deep breath and wiped her hands on her apron before stepping forward. "Sir," she said, addressing Mike, her voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, "I don't know who you are, but thank you." Mike nodded, offering a small smile. "Just a guy eating a burger," he said, sitting back down like nothing had happened. Miss Ruth chuckled softly at that, shaking her head. "Well, young man," she said, her voice warm, "you certainly handled that like someone who's done this before." Mike shrugged, taking a bite of his burger. "Let's just say I've been in a few situations." The other patrons in the diner exchanged glances, some recognizing him now, some still trying to process how a quiet afternoon at Mildred's had turned into something out of a movie. But one thing was clear, Roy and his crew wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. The waitress finally found her voice again. "Your meal's on the house," she said, smiling nervously. Mike shook his head. "Nah, I appreciate it, but I pay for my own meals." He pulled out a few bills and placed them on the table, nodding at Miss Ruth before returning to his food. Miss Ruth lifted her teacup, now refilled, and took a slow, measured sip. "Well," she said, glancing at the door where the bikers had disappeared, "I do believe that was the most excitement this place has seen in years." Mike smirked. "Hopefully, it stays that way." And with that, the diner returned to what it had always been, a quiet little stop on the edge of the highway, where people came for a warm meal, a hot cup of coffee, and, every now and then, a story they'd never forget. For a moment, weighing his words, the tension in the diner crept back in, the patrons holding their breath as they watched the exchange. The officer glanced at his partner, then back at the waitress. "That sound about right?" he asked. The waitress nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. If Mr. Tyson hadn't stepped in, I don't know what would have happened. That man was looking for trouble. Mike just made sure it didn't go any further." The officer turned to Miss Ruth. "And you, ma'am? Do you want to press charges?" Miss Ruth considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "That young man was a fool, but I don't want to spend my evening filing reports. I just want to finish my tea." The officer let out a quiet sigh, nodding. "Understood." He turned back to Mike. "Looks like you did this town a favor tonight." Mike shrugged. "Just did what anybody should." The officer studied him for a moment longer, then, with a small nod, reached into his pocket and pulled out a notepad. "We'll still need to file an incident report. Standard procedure. But from what I'm hearing, you won't be in any trouble." Mike nodded, unconcerned. "No problem." The officers asked a few more questions, jotting down notes, then exchanged a few words with the waitress before finally heading for the door. As they stepped outside, the older officer hesitated, glancing back at Mike one last time. There was something like respect in his eyes. Then he followed his partner to the squad car, and they drove off into the night. The diner finally exhaled. The tension, the uncertainty, it all faded with the flashing lights in the distance. Conversations resumed, chairs scraped against the floor, and the jukebox hummed back to life. Miss Ruth took another slow sip of her tea, then glanced at Mike with a knowing smile. "Looks like you saved the day, young man." Mike chuckled softly. "Just another day, ma'am." The waitress approached the table again, this time looking much more relaxed. "Well," she said, placing a fresh slice of peach pie in front of Miss Ruth and another in front of Mike. "If you won't let me comp your meal, at least let me say thanks properly." Mike glanced at the pie, then at the waitress. "Fair enough," he said with a smirk, picking up his fork. Miss Ruth chuckled, shaking her head. "A hero that won't take a free meal. Now that's something you don't see every day." Mike just smiled and took a bite of his pie, savoring the moment. Just another quiet night at Mildred's diner. They're smart about it. Never stay in one place too long, never leave enough evidence to pin them down. But tonight might be different. He turned to one of the officers and nodded. "Make sure we get all the surveillance footage from this place. If we can ID them, we might have something solid to work with." The officer moved toward the counter, speaking quietly with the waitress, who nodded rapidly before disappearing into the back to check the cameras. Mike leaned back slightly, his arms resting on the table. "So, what happens next?" he asked, his voice calm but direct. Harris exhaled, crossing his arms. "We put out an alert, track them down if we can. If they're dumb enough to come back, we'll be ready. But for now, I'd suggest you both be a little careful. They don't seem like the type to take embarrassment lightly." Miss Ruth gave a small, knowing smile as she took another sip of her tea. "Let them be angry," she said. "Men like that always burn themselves out eventually." Harris gave her a look of respect before nodding at Mike. "And you? You sticking around town or just passing through?" Mike considered the question for a moment, then shrugged. "Just grabbing a bite." Harris smirked at that. "Well, if you run into any more trouble, give us a call before you handle it yourself next time." Mike gave a small chuckle. "No promises." The detective shook his head but couldn't hide a faint smile. "All right, Mr. Tyson. I think we're done here. You have a good night." As the officers gathered the last of their notes and exited the diner, the tension finally, truly dissipated. The hum of normal conversation returned, forks clinking against plates, the distant sound of the jukebox playing an old blues tune. Mike glanced at Miss Ruth. "You need a ride home?" She smiled at him, setting her empty cup down. "No, young man. I've got my bus pass, and I've made it this far on my own." Mike nodded. "All right, but I'll wait until you're on it." Miss Ruth chuckled. "Now that, I won't argue with." The waitress came by one last time, a little less shaken now. "So, do you still want that pie, Mr. Tyson?" "On the house, of course." Mike smirked. "Yeah, I think I earned that pie." She laughed, hurrying off to get it. Miss Ruth folded her hands in her lap, watching him for a moment before speaking softly. "You're a good man, Mr. Tyson." Mike exhaled, shaking his head. "Still working on that." She smiled knowingly. "Aren't we all?" And with that, the two of them sat there in the quiet warmth of the diner, sharing a moment that neither of them, or anyone else there that night, would ever forget. There for a long moment, hands in his pockets, staring down the road even after she was gone. The weight of the night still lingered in the air, but something about Miss Ruth's quiet strength stuck with him. She wasn't afraid. She had seen worse, lived through worse. And yet, she still believed in the good in people. Mike exhaled, rolling his shoulders before turning back toward the diner. The waitress was inside clearing tables, a couple of regulars had returned to their conversations, and the jukebox hummed a soft, old melody that blended into the background. Just another night. But as he stepped toward his own car, he noticed something, parked a little too far down the lot, tucked into the shadows, an old motorcycle. The engine was off, but someone was sitting on it, watching. Mike didn't react right away. He just stood there, hands still in his pockets, his expression unreadable. But his posture shifted slightly, more alert, more prepared. The figure on the bike must have realized they'd been spotted because, without a word, they kicked the engine to life. The roar cut through the quiet, and with a sharp turn, the motorcycle peeled out onto the highway, disappearing into the night. Mike watched them go, his jaw tightening. So, it wasn't over. He had expected as much. With a slow breath, he pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and tapped a name. After a few rings, a voice on the other end picked up. "Yeah?" Mike's gaze stayed locked on the empty highway. "Hey," he said, voice calm but firm. "Might need a favor." The voice on the other end chuckled, low and knowing. "That so?" Mike nodded to himself. "Yeah. Think I just made some new friends." A pause. "Then, I'll be there." Mike ended the call, slipping his phone back into his pocket. The bikers thought they could play their little games. Thought they could intimidate people like Miss Ruth, like the others who wouldn't fight back. But this time, they had picked the wrong diner. And the wrong guy. Mike stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, staring down the empty road. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine trees from the forest nearby. He exhaled slowly, letting the tension of the evening settle. He hadn't planned on stepping into a situation like this today. All he had wanted was a quiet meal, a moment to himself. Instead, he found himself reminded of something bigger, the kind of man he wanted to be. The kind of man his mentors had once pushed him to become. A car passed by, breaking him from his thoughts. He turned and walked toward his vehicle, parked on the far side of the lot. Just as he reached it, another car pulled into the diner, a beat-up old SUV, its tires crunching against the gravel. Instinctively, Mike tensed, his senses sharpening. But as the doors opened, he saw it wasn't the bikers returning. Instead, a young family stepped out, a father, a mother, and a child, all laughing as they headed inside. Mike let out a small breath and climbed into his car. The warmth of the diner's neon lights glowed in his rearview mirror, casting long shadows across the lot. He rested his hands on the wheel but didn't turn the key. Instead, he stared out at the highway, the endless stretch of road, always leading somewhere new. He thought about all the places he had been, all the fights he had won, both inside and outside the ring. But today felt different. This wasn't about fame, about proving himself, or making headlines. It was about something much simpler, doing the right thing. His mother's words echoed in his mind, grounding him in a way few things could. It doesn't matter how strong you are if you don't use that strength for good. Meanwhile, back at her modest home, Miss Ruth settled into her favorite chair by the window. A cup of tea steamed beside her, her phone resting in her lap. She had already spoken to her son, though she downplayed the more frightening parts of the day. No need to worry him more than necessary. As she stared out at the quiet street, she reflected on everything that had happened, the fear, the anger, the humiliation. But those feelings were overshadowed by something far more powerful, gratitude. Gratitude for the strangers who had spoken up. For the officers who had taken her seriously. And most of all, for the man who had stepped in when it mattered most. She picked up her phone again, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number for her grandchildren. A smile crept across her face as she pressed the call button. When the youngest answered, her voice bright and full of energy, Miss Ruth felt her spirits lift. "Grandma, are you okay?" the child asked after hearing a brief version of the story. Miss Ruth chuckled softly. "I'm more than okay, sweetheart. Today, I was reminded that there are still good people in the world." And the story didn't end there. Word of what had happened at Mildred's diner spread fast. The waitress shared it with her friends. The customers who had witnessed it told their families. And soon, it became something of a local legend. People talked about the quiet strength of Miss Ruth. About the unexpected heroism of Mike Tyson. For those who had been there, it was a moment they wouldn't forget. A reminder that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. As for Mike, the road ahead stretched endlessly before him. But tonight, he felt lighter somehow. The world could be a dark place, full of cruelty, selfishness, and men like Roy. But it could also be a place of kindness, courage, and people like Miss Ruth. And as long as he had the strength, Mike knew exactly which side he'd be fighting for. The hum of the highway faded behind him as the stars began to break through the darkening sky. For now, he drove on. But if the world needed him again, Mike Tyson would be ready.